Madam President, I yield myself such time as I may consume. Thomas Jefferson was right when he said we needed an amendment to the Constitution limiting our power to borrow. I was elected to the House in 1974. That year, the deficit was $6 billion. The total debt was $484 billion. That year, what we spent in the total federal budget was less than we spent on interest last year. Since 1980, we have spent $1.7 trillion on interest, and in the next 5 years, we will spend $1.7 trillion in interest, and it gets worse. With all due respect to my friend from New York, whose charts stop before it starts getting worse there. And who pays that $1.7 trillion? People of limited means. Who collects it? Those who are more fortunate economically. We will, this year, spend 10 times as much on interest, 8 times as much on interest, I should say, as on education. We will spend twice as much on interest as all the poverty programs combined. And as that interest grows, we squeeze out programs for the poor and education. The checks and balances have gone awry. 25 years in a row, we have had deficits. James Madison warned about majoritarian abuses, and that's why 8 different times in the Constitution there are cases where the majority cannot prevail, and that's why we have a Bill of Rights where the majority cannot prevail. James Madison wrote, "The legislative branch is the most powerful and most likely to be abused because it is under the least control." The arguments against this: recession. Since 1962, we have had 11 stimulus packages that have passed this Senate, all of them by more than 60 votes. That's what we require. And talking about recessions, that money we spend on interest is not countercyclical, unlike Social Security money. When you give money to people who are wealthy, they save it when things go bad. And a good chunk of it goes beyond our borders. 17% of that $300 billion goes overseas, 17% plus. Every argument I have heard on the floor during these days, we had in 1986. The argument, we can balance the budget without a constitutional amendment. Then the deficit was $2 trillion. Now it is $4.5 trillion, and we hear the same songs and with the same effect. Madam President, 2 arguments I have not heard from my friends who are in the opposition. One is there has been no reference whatsoever to that 17% of our debt that is held by other countries. The reality is there's going to come a day of reckoning. If Senator Mikulski were the president of the First National Bank in Carbondale, Illinois, and I came to you and I said, I would like to spend more money than I take in this year, and you looked at my balance sheet, you might lend it to me 1 year, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, but at some point a prudent banker would say, I'm going to put my money somewhere else. And prudent international bankers are going to say precisely the same thing. Lester Thoreau, the distinguished economist, has told us the question is not if international bankers and people who have money here in our bonds are going to take their money out. The question is when. And we ought to stop this before we get to the edge of the cliff. The second thing that I have not heard referred to by a single member of the opposition. I heard a lot of history from my friend Senator Robert Byrd, and I happen to be a lover of history, and he contributes immensely to this body. I read his 13 or 14 essays about ancient Greece and Rome and all of that. What I did not hear from him or anyone else in the opposition is the history of monetizing debt from ancient Florence down through the current times. And if you believe the figures given us just weeks ago by OMB, we will, under the most optimistic scenario, future generations will spend 66 to 75% of their lifetime earnings in taxation. Under the optimistic scenario that will save every penny that they say will save in the health care reform, and I'm a co-sponsor of it, under the optimistic scenario that we're going to have 10 solid years of economic progress, 66 to 75% lifetime earnings going for taxation, Madam President, it isn't going to happen. We'll start printing funny money before that happens, as every other nation has done. Those who vote against this amendment are taking the gamble that we can be the first nation in history to pile up that much debt relative to national income and not monetize the debt, not print the funny money. What good does it do to get $1,000 in Social Security if a loaf of bread costs $100? We have to face this reality, and we're not facing it. Every other generation of Americans took care of themselves and invested in the future. We are the first generation of Americans to partially take care of ourselves and borrow from the future. It has to stop, and there is only one way to make it stop, and that is a constitutional amendment. Senator Danforth says this is like taking arsenic because it's a slow, gradual death. And that's what it is. Former Senator Paul Tsongas said we have a debt addiction. And like a drug addiction or an alcohol addiction, getting rid of the addiction is painful. When they say on the floor that it's going to be painful if we adopt this amendment, I have never suggested anything to the contrary. But it's going to be infinitely more painful if we don't get rid of the debt addiction. That we have to face, and the American people have to face. Senator Cohen on this floor this afternoon said what we're doing is fiscal child abuse. That's precisely it. I have one granddaughter, and I'm going to become a grandparent twice more this year, if I may brag, Madam President. What we're doing is borrowing money from those children. And if I have a choice, and if the American people have a choice of a little pain now and not borrowing from those children, I think the American people want to make the same decision I have made. Let's have a little pain now, and let's do what's right for the future of those children. We can create a more prosperous country. The Wharton School says if we adopt this, 30-year bonds are going to go from 6.5% to 2.5%. What that would do to industrial investment, home construction, and everything else. New York Federal Reserve Board says we lost 3.25 million jobs because of the deficit from 1978 to 1988. How many more millions we're going to lose before we get a hold of this, I don't know. We face a choice, finally, Madam President, of agreeing with those who say let's continue to drift, or agreeing with Thomas Jefferson that we ought to limit our borrowing. And I want to agree with Thomas Jefferson. I want an amendment to the Constitution.
The senator's time has expired. Who yields time?
Madam President, how much time remains?
Under the previous order, the senator from West Virginia now controls 30 minutes.
And the other side controls. The two leaders have 20 minutes each.
The senator is correct.
Madam President, I yield 3 minutes to my friend from Maryland, Senator Sarbanes.
Madam President, I thank the distinguished chairman of the Appropriations